If I were 25 again, starting in 2026, I wouldn't try to be smart. I would just try not to be stupid. There are days when remembrance weighs more than analysis. Numbers are light. They vanish with a keystroke. But memories remain. They carry the texture of failure, the stench of fear, and the quiet humiliation of once believing you were invincible. My name is Benjamin Graham. Some call me the father of value investing, a flattering but inaccurate title. If I am the father of anything, it is the father of a long list of mistakes. I spent my youth believing that intelligence was a fortress, that numbers, analysis, formulas, and logic could protect a person from destruction. But I discovered that intelligence is a weak shield against the human heart. People don't go bankrupt for lack of knowledge. They go bankrupt for lack of control. Over time, I learned that being smart is easy. Remaining rational is rare. I remember 1929 as if it were yesterday. The smell of ink on paper, the warmth of kindness, the sound of typewriters recording fortunes that would soon vanish. I was running the Graham-Newman partnership at the time. I had my charts, my ratios, my analyses, my precise valuations. I believed I was immune to chaos. Then, within a few weeks, the market wiped out 70% of my world. The headlines screamed, "Markets evaporate. Investors disappear." I watched the men who once walked upright now whisper in corners, calculating not profit, but survival. And in the silence that followed, a single sentence dawned on me. When panic flares, logic becomes meaningless. It wasn't the market that failed me. It was my illusion of mastery. I analyzed companies, not people, and I realized that people are far more volatile than any stock. This experience didn't make me wise. It made me humble. But later, I realized that humility was also a form of intelligence, perhaps the rarest form of intelligence. Years later, at Columbia University, I taught young students who reminded me of myself, eager, intelligent, and dangerously confident. I began each semester the same way. An investor's worst enemy is probably themselves. It sounded like advice, but it was a confession. Every student wanted a formula, a secret ratio that would make them rich. They hadn't realized that the biggest variable in any investment was the investor himself. Among these students, there was one who listened differently. Quiet, cautious, almost painfully patient. His name was Warren. One afternoon, after class, he asked, "Mr. Graham, you say intelligence isn't enough. What is enough?" I smiled. "Competence is never a number, Warren. It's a mindset." He nodded slowly, as if pushing the thought aside for later use. And indeed, he used it brilliantly. As I grew older, I began to see markets not as mechanisms, but as mirrors. They reflect human nature more accurately than any philosophy ever could. Prices are emotions made visible: fear, hope, denial, greed. Investors think they're competing with each other, but they're actually wrestling with their own impulses. The market is a stage, and we are both players and spectators. We applaud our gains, curse our losses, never realizing we're playing the same game generation after generation. To invest successfully, we must first understand our own psychology. This, not accounting, is the true curriculum of finance. Knowledge has a price. Every fact you learn adds another gram to the invisible weight you carry. Because once you learn it, you can't ignore it. Intelligence breeds arrogance. Arrogance leads to destruction. When I was young, every dollar I earned felt like proof that I was right. But profits are the most deceptive teachers. "You are special," they whisper. Luck, when it works, feels exactly like genius. And by the time you realize the difference, it's too late. So I began writing down every principle that had survived my own incompetence, not to impress others, but to remind myself of what not to forget. I called him the intelligent investor, But in hindsight, I might as well have called him the recovering fool. In one of my old notebooks, I found a sentence I wrote after a sleepless night in 1934. In the short run, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine. This sentence has gone around the world. People now repeat it as if it were a law. But when I wrote it, it wasn't wisdom, it was weariness. I'd seen popularity erode while substance persisted. And I realized that over time, the market weighs character, not profit. The scales are relentless. Every decade, it reveals the difference between intelligence and discipline. Years later, Warren once asked me, "Do you think rationality can endure?" I laughed softly. Rationality is a visitor, Warren. It doesn't live with us. It only comes when fear is silenced. Humans are not rational creatures with feelings and emotions. We are emotional creatures who sometimes test logic. Now, as I approach the twilight of my years, I see finance for what it truly is, not a monetary science, but a mirror of human weakness. Markets don't create greed, they expose it. They don't invent fear, they measure it. And yet each generation insists that this time is different. It never is. Names change, technologies evolve, charts shine with new colors. But the heart behind the transactions beats with the same rhythm of anxiety and desire. If I were 25 in 2026, I wouldn't be trying to outsmart the algorithms. I wouldn't be chasing trends, tokens, or digital euphoria. I would simply try, once again, to master the oldest trade in existence. Mastering one's own mind. Patience would be my lever. Character, my margin of safety. Sometimes I would still lose money, but I wouldn't lose myself. And when the next crash came, and it always does, I would remember what every young investor forgets. The market tests your portfolio once a decade, but it tests your temperament daily. To anyone reading this in a future I can only imagine, I hope you have more data than I do. And yet, somehow more doubt. Information was scarce when I was alive. Today, it's infinite, and that's the real danger. Investors in my time struggled to find the truth. Investors in your time struggled to filter it. You swim in an ocean of numbers, news, forecasts, analyses, and algorithms, each promising to predict tomorrow. But remember this. An abundance of data doesn't mean an abundance of wisdom. In 1929, we drowned in optimism. In 2025, you drown in certainty. I see you checking your portfolios on devices glowing in your palms, reacting to news that evaporates within hours. You believe that faster analysis means better decisions. But time doesn't accelerate wisdom, it erodes patience. And I've learned that patience is the last real advantage. I once said the market is a voting machine in the short term. Now it's a hive mind buzzing with billions of dollars in noise. You're no longer trading against others, but against code. And yet, beneath every algorithm, the same old enemy lurks: emotion. Fear now wears a digital mask. Greed comes disguised as convenience. You call it momentum, emotion, but still, the same ancient instincts. The instinct to run when others run, to chase when others chase. I'm told that machines now make decisions faster than thought itself. But if you let a machine think for you, who will feel sorry for you when everything collapses? Remember this. Technology may make you productive, but only discipline can set you free. You live in an age that worships visibility. Everything can be measured: followers, profits, impressions, reach. But the best investors I know sought invisibility. They didn't brag. They accumulated quietly. They understood that wealth grows best in silence. In your world, silence has become a luxury. Noise is the new oxygen, and you're suffocating from it. If I could speak to you face to face, I would say, turn off the lights. Turn off the screen. Listen to your own judgment. If you can't hear clearly, don't trade. Today's greatest danger isn't loss, but distraction. The investor of 2025 fails not from ignorance, but from burnout. The irony of modern finance is that everyone is smart, and therefore intelligence no longer matters. When everyone learns the formulas, everyone studies the same reports, everyone follows the same strategies, opportunities disappear. So, where does wisdom lie? In character, in limitations. When the world demands more, it makes a difference by doing less. Intelligence, when left unchecked, is self-destructive. It overanalyzes, overreacts, overthinks. It confuses activity with progress. I've encountered people who know the financials of many large companies by heart, but can't manage their own jealousy. In every era, the market punishes one of these same mistakes: arrogance disguised as intelligence. I must admit it's a strange paradox. When I was young, I pursued wealth for freedom. But as I grew richer, I felt I was losing my freedom. Wealth leads to anxiety. Losses liberate, in a harsh but honest way. You might not believe it, but your search for peace is found when you give up money. A wise investor doesn't seek abundance. They desire to control their desires. If it can do that, the market can't harm it. Because the market can't touch what it's not drawn to. I can see it in your world, a similar storm that once affected mine. The same patterns, only transferred to the digital world. You call it volatility. I called it human nature. While faces change and tools evolve, fear remains, intense, ancient, and irrational. You can't overcome this fear with intelligence, nor can you escape it with technology. But you can overcome it with understanding. Recognize your fear, it becomes powerless. If you ignore it, it holds you captive. You've created machines that can learn, but you've forgotten how to learn. You're outsourcing judgment to algorithms, intuition to data, curiosity to simplicity. You've made the investment process simpler and therefore riskier, because it served as a filter in a difficult time. Only the patient survived. Now everyone gets to play, and therefore no one learns. The easier the process, the harder it is to think. I don't envy you, but I admire you for living in a time when you can think instead of react. Your greatest advantage, history. All my failures are written down for you. All my doubts are documented. Every principle I formed in my panic is clearly presented to you. Yet, I fear you will ignore them, just as I ignored the wisdom that came before me. This seems to be the price of progress, a situation where we remember the data but forget the lessons. So, even if you remember nothing from this letter, remember this. Unless you stop competing with others, you can't surpass them. True competition is an internal struggle between your discipline and your desires. This conflict never ends. That's why markets never change. I once believed I could calculate value. But value is not a number. It's a relationship. It's the distance between what you want and what you're willing to endure for it. It's the difference between market noise and your inner peace. Price indicates how much the market values something. Value, in turn, tells you how much it means to you. Every investor must solve this equation for themselves. And I assure you, the answer is never entirely material. Towards the end, I sold all my assets. Not because I feared loss, but because I sought peace. For the first time in my life, I experienced unclaimed wealth. If I have any advice, it's this: buy wisdom when it's cheap. Give up your ego when it's expensive. And remember, you'll never own the market, but you can own your actions. This is the one trade that will never lose its relevance. To the investor of 2025, you're not fighting the market. You're fighting the part of you that wants to belong to it. There's a strange stagnation in the space between memory and forgetting. That's where I find myself now, neither alive nor dead, simply lost in thought. From here, I can see the life I left behind, the world you now have. The graphs are still rising and falling. People are still searching for certainty, and they're losing themselves in that search. It feels almost cruelly poetic. After spending most of one's life observing cycles, discovering that the truest cycle is the one we live in. Every generation repeats the same mistake. They confuse progress with wisdom. You call it innovation. I call it speculation. Our expressions are different, and so are our weaknesses. In the past, I thought greed was only linked to money. Now I perceive it differently. Greed is simply a refusal to be satisfied. That silent voice that says, just a little more. That whisper is eternal. It was there in the stock market crash of 1929, in the internet craze of 1999, and now it whispers beneath your screens in 2025. Every new generation thinks they can limit greed with data, and every crisis reminds them that greed has no definitive limits. It's possible to regulate markets, but you can't legislate satisfaction. This isn't a matter of law. It's a matter of the soul. And as long as the soul remains unsettled, the markets will continue to falter. As I get older, I've come to place less importance on numbers, not because they're wrong, but because they only reveal a fraction of the truth. A company's accounting can be audited. A life's accounting cannot. It's possible to value a stock by its profit. How do you determine the value of a year's peace of mind? Or that moment when you realize you don't need more? These are forms of wealth, too, but they don't appear in financial reports. If I could reorganize my own records, I'd add a new column next to profits. Quiet time. Because in the end, that's all that matters. When you spend your life trying to manipulate the markets, you begin to question whether death is merely a correction or a recalibration of value. I often wondered how my ideas would survive independently of me. Could they still make sense in an era of instantaneous transactions? Or would they seem old and naive? But now I understand. Principles are universal. Only tactics stand the test of time. The truths that guide my world, discipline, patience, humility, will also influence yours, long after every algorithm has become obsolete. Human nature cannot be manipulated. Only results can be delayed. Sometimes I imagine that 2 centuries from now, an investor, perhaps not even human, will be looking through our records, my name a footnote in the archives of ancient finance. I think they're smiling, realizing that, despite all our theories, we were only trying to understand fear. Perhaps they'll say, those early investors were emotional beings, trapped within the confines of their psyches. And they'll be right. But what they don't understand is that our weaknesses are also our strengths. We cared. We could feel. We loved. We lost. We hoped. We despaired. Emotions, though not rational, gave depth to the numbers. Without them, the market would be a machine, perhaps efficient, but inert. I used to think that legacy was about what endures. Now I see it's about those who continue to learn. The book I wrote, The Intelligent Investor, wasn't written to make people rich. It was written to make them stable. Stability isn't celebrated. It doesn't create a trend. But that's precisely the foundation of true wealth. In your era, you focused on virality. In mine, we focused on longevity. And both desires stem from the same source, the fear of being forgotten. But you can't influence time. You can only tell the truth and expect it to resonate. If any part of my voice still reaches you, let it say this. The purpose of investing is not to increase returns, but to reduce regrets. Control is a major fallacy of every intelligence. We develop various systems, formulas, and predictions as if we can overcome chance. But chance is not the enemy. It's proof that life still throws up unexpected situations. A true investor doesn't try to control the market. They try to manage its reactions. Control your losses, not your luck. Control your actions, not the outcome. Once you gain this awareness, You are no longer a part of the chaos, but merely a silent observer. I believe this is the most important moment a person can approach peace. For years, I believed that wisdom comes from success. Now I understand that it comes from survival. Survivors are not the bravest or the smartest, but those who manage to remain calm while others lose their minds. The market rewards those who are patient, but life rewards those who forgive themselves for their shortcomings. You are bound to lose. You will make the wrong decision. You will experience panic. And yet, you can be wise. Wisdom is not the purity of decisions. It is perseverance through doubt. In this context, every mistake is a lesson. At some point, there is no need for a teacher. The student must simply sit quietly and watch. If you've listened this far, perhaps you've begun to realize what I once failed to see. Investing isn't about money. It's about meaning. Money is merely a mirror of your relationship with control, fear, time, and ego. When you realize this, the graphs disappear, and clarity emerges. It doesn't come with applause. It comes only with peace. And when peace comes, you'll finally understand why people like me spend our entire lives chasing numbers. What we truly seek is serenity. I don't know if the world will remember my name, but I hope you remember the concept that began it all. Intelligence is meaningless without discipline. Success is worthless without peace. Wealth is worthless without wisdom. When the next great crash comes, and it will, I hope you remember this letter and smile instead of panic. Because if you remember these things, my life's work will not have been in vain. And perhaps in that quiet moment, somewhere beyond your screen, you will hear an old man whisper, "Be wise, be patient, be free." When the body fades, words remain. They tangle among the papers, the memory, the invisible threads of your century. Some nights, as a young investor rummages through the archives at 2 a.m., my sentences flicker across your screen like the glow of an old candle. He reads a sentence, "Be smart, be patient, be free." And even though decades separate us, I feel him breathing a little slower. That's a teacher's hope. Someone somewhere pauses. A student. His name is Alex. He lives in a glass apartment, high above a sleepless city. While the market is moving, he's already awake. He knows every metric, every indicator, every rumor. He trades in seconds, not with his thoughts. One evening, overwhelmed by his losses, he types my name into a search bar. He finds the intelligent investor. He buys a battered digital copy for $2.99. He begins to read. The investor's biggest problem and their biggest enemy is probably themselves. He pauses. He smiles, a smile that belies his weariness. How can someone who lived in 1949 understand me in 2025? He whispers. He doesn't know that understanding doesn't age with time. Fear doesn't bring new things. It just takes different forms. When he reaches Mr. Market, he feels the old man communicating directly with him through the pause of time. Imagine Mr. Market offering to buy your stock or sell his own at different prices every day. Alex smiles slightly. He's met this man. He can be seen in every trade, every chart, and every headline. Alex, Mr. Graham, do you really exist? Benjamin, I'm as real as an unforgettable lecture. Alex, the market doesn't work like it used to. Artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning. Benjamin, in my day, it was money, telegrams, and rumors. The tools change. The temptations remain constant. Alex, but speed is paramount now. Everyone works faster. Benjamin, so maybe wisdom lies in moving slowly. The young man frowned. He searched for a solution, but instead he was met with only silence. Alex looked at his phone, alerts, warnings, signals, all waiting for a response. Everything is urgent, he said. No, the old voice replied. Everything feels urgent. This is different. He turned off notifications for the first time in years. The room went completely silent. For the first time, he could hear his own heartbeat. Alex looks at his portfolio. The red and green lines move like a heartbeat. How do I know the value of something, he asks. And I reply, when you have it and can sleep soundly. I tell him that value isn't what the market says it is. It's what your conscience can bear. The screen doesn't respond, but it doesn't need it. A week goes by. His transactions dwindle. Evenings grow longer. He walks instead of watching charts. He eats without checking prices. One night, he asks, how do I know I have enough? I tell him the truth I learned too late. Sufficiency begins the moment you stop comparing. He closes the app. The city outside hums with hunger, but inside, a single screen goes black. Then comes the crash, as it always does. The headlines scream. The markets fall like a stone. The same panic, now in new colors. Alex feels the first pang of fear. He almost opens the app again. Almost. Then he remembers the voice. The market tests your temperament every day. He breathes. He waits. And for the first time in his life, he does nothing. Weeks later, while others count their losses, Alex is still standing. Not richer, not poorer, just unbroken. He realizes that resistance itself is a form of profit, the kind that can't be measured, but can be experienced. He whispers into the air, thank you. And even though I no longer exist, I hear it. I think that's how ideas live. Not by fame, but by acceptance. Every time a man resists the madness of the crowd, every time a woman chooses patience over panic, a piece of my thoughts is revived. Not because I'm smart, but because I've been wrong and learned. And that, in the end, is what teaching is. Transferring the price of one man's mistakes to another's wisdom. Alex no longer needs the book. He has absorbed it. Like a calm sea absorbs light. He begins teaching others, silently, ostensibly. His students now quote him, unknowing my echo. And I, somewhere beyond time, smile. Because the conversation continues. And perhaps always will. The market changes 1,000 times. Human nature never changes. Between these two constants lies the opportunity and the danger of every age. Every person leaves behind a balance sheet, not of numbers, but of choices. Mine was full of contradictions. For every success, a regret. For every student I enlighten, another I fail to understand. When I wrote about the margin of safety, I wasn't just talking about stocks. I confessed that I had never found one that suited the human heart. You can hedge against risk, but not against time. And so, in the silence between two centuries, I find myself calculating peace, not profit. The mind has its own accountants. They review every decision, every transaction, every silence. Some entries I would correct if I could. Others I would delete entirely. I remember the years of the Great Depression. Students looked at me with eyes full of hunger and disbelief. They needed hope, not lectures. Back then, I still believed that logic could save us. Now I know, logic only guides, never heals. We rationalists are a strange breed. We study numbers so as not to feel them. We preach patience, fearing irrelevance. We measure everything but meaning. In my youth, I thought the purpose of investing was independence. Later, I learned about resilience. And now, I think about understanding. Investing is actually about facing uncertainty, not conquering it, but coexisting with it without losing one's mind. This lesson took me 40 years and the loss of almost everything I held dear. I can no longer see the modern world clearly, its screens, its speed, its invisible currencies. But I can feel its pulse. And somewhere, I feel someone like Alex standing where I once stood. Confused, ambitious, afraid of being ordinary. He's not my student, but my continuation. He lives in a century I can never touch. And yet, every time he resists panic, every time he questions hype, every time he chooses reason, he completes the sentence I left unfinished. I was once asked, what is the greatest protection an investor can have? Discipline, I said, but I was wrong. It's a matter of conscience. Discipline can be learned. Conscience must be earned. If you can maintain your values despite the fluctuations of markets, culture, and self, no downer can bankrupt you. I believe this is the ultimate definition of wealth. Here I am, riding on the edge of infinity. No graphs, no data, just thoughts. I realize now that the purpose of my life was not to teach people to profit, but to be at peace with themselves. After all, the market is merely a reflection. What we fear is what we avoid. I have been both a teacher and a student, an analyst and an anomaly. And as my words fade into the silence of the century, I find peace in a simple truth. A rational mind is like a compass. A moral heart represents the destination. If I were 25 years old from 2026, I would do nothing extraordinary. I would listen longer. I would read slower. I would prefer to think in decades, not days. I would invest in ideas, not illusions. And most importantly, I would remember that intelligence without humility is just another form of ignorance. The markets will forget my name. The world will move on. But maybe a reader will remember a sentence. Perhaps that's enough. I have a strange feeling that a man who lived half a century before I was born hasn't followed me. Every morning, when I open my trading terminal, I expect to see him. In the soft light on my monitor, he doesn't judge. He simply observes. There's a silent authority in his absence, as if a silence he's been taught, as if he's now ignorant of the code that shapes my world. There's no longer a crowded market floor, no more shouting people. The hum of invisible machines. A conversation between algorithms too fast for the human pulse to keep up with. But greed? Fear? It hasn't changed yet. Graham once wrote, some things are measured not by time, but by eternity. We call it progress because it creates a different impression, because it feels innovative and feels like success. But when you look deeper, the same old, irrational heart beats. It's just hiding behind better data. Screens, metrics, headlines. Promising clarity, but creating obsession. Sometimes I realize it's not me analyzing the market, but the market analyzing me. Every click, every hesitation, every glance at the chart is a learning signal. The market has become aware of behaviors, not values. And that's what scares me the most. I remember the first time I closed a position and felt nothing. No enthusiasm, no loss, no ego, just neutrality. It was the closest thing to peace I've ever felt. That night, I reread Graham's words, not from the book, but from something I'd written years ago on a yellowed note. You are not your portfolio. A remarkably simple statement, but a rebellion in a world that has forced us to measure our value with numbers. I once believed that technology would make us smarter. Access to infinite data was supposed to put an end to irrationality. But the opposite has happened. We are now overwhelmed by numbers and searching for meaning. Algorithms feed on volatility. They depend on our fear for their functionality. Every panicked tweet, every emotional transaction, every trend doesn't just affect prices. It trains the system. And so we've created a god of charts. A god who caters to our impulses. Graham would smile wistfully at this and say, you've managed your madness with machines. It was Thursday. I don't remember the date, only the emotion of the moment. A sudden crash. The markets had crashed in minutes. Billions were lost before most people had finished their coffee. In the chaos, I saw something terrifying. The reflection on the black screen of a frozen terminal. For a moment, I couldn't tell whether it was the market or me that had crashed. At that moment, I finally understood what he meant by margin of safety. It wasn't a number. It was a boundary of identity. How much of yourself can you afford to lose before it breaks? That night, I did something no one in my world had ever done. I stopped everything. The screens, the alarms, the noise of data. Silence spread like a fog through the room. At first, it was overwhelming. Then, it had a liberating effect. And in that silence, I heard my own voice again. Faint, as if lost to time. Patience isn't inaction. It's choosing a more opportune time. I smiled. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't chasing the market. I thought I understood it. Or maybe I was finally beginning to understand myself. Sometimes I wonder, am I still an investor? Or have I evolved into something different? Perhaps that's what Graham wanted all along, to turn investors into philosophers. Because after you've seen enough cycles, you stop asking how you're going to win and start asking why you're playing. And when that question really sinks into your bones, you realize most people don't invest for wealth. They invest for validation. That's why markets never rest. They prey on our insecurity. But those who learn to find meaning beyond money stop being prey. Sometimes I still write him notes. Not because I believe he can hear me, but because I know someone will read it someday. Perhaps another version of me. Nearly 20 years later. Perhaps someone lost, hungry, wandering through old ideas in search of wisdom. And perhaps they'll find this story. And, for a moment, feel the quiet understanding that once found me. The conversation will continue. It always continues. There are two kinds of people in every generation. Those who learn from the noise, and those who learn from the silence. BG. There are markets we measure by numbers, and markets we pretend don't exist. The market of reputation, the market of attention, the market of the soul. You can't chart it on a Bloomberg terminal, but it's there, trading every moment we stray from what matters. I used to think the stock market was humanity's greatest mirror. Now I know it's a smaller reflection of a deeper shift, where we trade honesty for influence, integrity for belonging. The currency isn't the dollar. It's validation. I meet them every day, men and women with perfect profiles, selling wisdom in 20-second clips. They quote Graham, Munger, and Buffett, but they don't stop long enough to understand them. They don't invest, they perform. They use their portfolios as props. They use their beliefs as costumes. They see their audiences as real beings. It's easy to mock them, but the truth is, I was one of them. I confused visibility with credibility, and I confused action with meaning. There's a silent disease spreading through modern greed. It's not greed. Greed is honesty. It's a pretense, the illusion of knowledge, the comfort of imitation. When I started, I wanted to understand the market. Then I wanted to beat it. Now I just want to be honest. But honesty doesn't trend. It doesn't virus. It doesn't sell lessons. And yet, when the noise subsides, that's all that remains. Graham taught me that every investor needs a margin of safety. I believe every human being needs a moral margin. Something you don't sell, not for applause, not for fear, not even for survival. I used to think this saying was about ethics. Now I know it's about identity. When you replace what you believe with what you want, you don't take action, you surrender. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I imagine Graham walking through this modern chaos. He'd see charts shining like stained glass in cathedrals of greed. He'd see analysts worshiping numbers as if they were holy scripture. He'd smile, not with admiration, but with appreciation. He'd say, the same temple, new idols. He'd remind us that reason isn't about being right. It's about staying whole when everything around you falls apart. And maybe that's what reason has always been about. Not dominating the market, but protecting the mind from itself. Last month, I made the biggest profit of my career. 7 figures in a single quarter. But when I saw the number on the screen, I felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Just the quiet awareness that I'd spent years chasing a feeling that didn't exist. I didn't celebrate that night. I went for a walk. It started to rain, and somewhere between the city lights and the wet asphalt, I understood something I'd never understood before. We don't seek wealth to be free. We seek it to feel worthy. And that's it. That's the real bubble. Knowledge has its price. Every truth you learn costs you an illusion. I've lost the comfort of ignorance. I can't ignore the cycles. How the same mistakes take on new guises, decade after decade. But perhaps that's the real problem. Perhaps progress isn't about avoiding constant repetition. Perhaps it's about learning to recognize it sooner. Graham once said, "Those who forget the past are condemned to relive it." And indeed, he was right. But what he didn't point out is that remembering is painful. Because when you understand human nature, you cease to be amazed by it. And with it comes a quiet sadness, a kind of wisdom that feels like mourning. Yet, there are gains that no collapse can erase. The peace that follows patience, the virtue of restraint, the beauty of scorn and yet standing tall. These are my true gains. They don't figure in the calculations. They grow quietly. And if that makes me traditional, perhaps I was never meant to be modern. Sometimes I wonder what Graham thinks of me. About this time, this endless search for certainty. Then I realize, he's already answered that. He told us that intelligence without humility is risky, that wealth without wisdom is fleeting. The rest, the noise, the hype, the fame, was never part of the equation. We only included it as an addition because we couldn't bear that something so powerful could be so simple. Every era carries the idea of being the last wise generation. Then it becomes a cautionary tale. Perhaps that's the way it should be. Perhaps wisdom cannot be passed on. Perhaps it's rediscovered each time the loud voice becomes irritating and someone, somewhere, takes action to destroy it. And in that silence, they will hear it, that faint voice of reason that never disappears. Markets recover, luck returns, but character, once lost, rarely reappears. I used to think of it as the silence of the past, but it's not actually like that. It whispers through choices, in the momentary pause between action and consequence. Lately, I've begun to hear it again, not as a ghost, but as a thought that refuses to fade. When I open a book, when I look at a chart, when I face myself peacefully, there it is. It doesn't lecture. It simply listens. It doesn't feel like remembering. It feels like continuing a truly never-ending discussion. There's a strange burden that comes with being overly informed. Not arrogance, but fatigue. The kind that comes when you understand why people make the same mistakes over and over. Because the truth is instantly unbearable. Data varies, but the heart is resilient. Not for profit. We invest for peace, with the belief that chaos can be controlled. And yet Graham's voice cuts through the fog. The market is not a machine to be mastered. It is a mirror to be understood. The frequency of this sentence bothers me, because it applies not just to markets. It also applies to life. In his final letters, Graham emphasized peace. Not wealth, not fame, peace. He described extensions of a thought from his students, each carrying fragments of a larger idea. I had never grasped this until now. We don't learn to preserve wisdom. We learn so that one day, when someone else stands where we stand, we can pass it on. That's true compound interest. Not capital. Consciousness. I now work with data that seems like science fiction. Artificial intelligence systems that can predict trends before humans blink. Terrifyingly efficient. But one aspect he holds sacred is missing. Doubt. The very definition of wisdom. Machines don't hesitate. They calculate. And in this perfection, humans lose something. The humility born of uncertainty. Graham used to say, the biggest challenge, indeed, the worst adversary, for an investor is probably themselves. He couldn't have known how relevant this would be in an environment where our digital identities move faster than our real selves. But even now, I believe the antidote remains unchanged. Stop. Think. Resist. Here's the modern safety net. A few nights ago, I dreamed of him. He was standing in an empty conference room, an old board, a light dust in the air. He turned to me and said, "Have you learned?" "What have you learned?" I asked. He smiled. The difference between being clever and being wise. And then he was gone. When I woke up, I understood the meaning of the dream. Cleverness is knowing how to win. Wisdom is knowing when not to gamble. There's only one notebook in my office. There are no numbers in it. Just sentences, lessons distilled from the noise of years. On one page it reads, "The price of truth is loneliness." On another page, "Rationality without empathy is calculating." And on the very last page, written this morning, "If I were 25 again, starting in 2026, I wouldn't do anything exotic." A borrowed sentence, but also reborn, because it no longer belongs to him. It belongs to all of us who refuse to prioritize our sanity over speed. One day, someone will read these words the way I read his. They won't know me. They won't have to. The author isn't the important thing. The echo. That's how reason survives. Not through possession, but through transmission. Each generation interprets the same truth differently, but the essence remains the same. Be reasonable. Be patient. Be free. That's where it ends. Not through revelation, but through understanding. Wisdom is not inherited. It is applied. And the quiet man from another century, who once studied the markets by candlelight, still teaches through me, through you, through everyone who pauses before responding. The market will crash again. The noise will rise again. But so will the silence. And in that silence, his voice, our voice, will whisper once more. Between intelligence and emotion, choose character. The candle burns dimly. The graphs fade. The lesson remains. We are all temporary guardians of the same idea. Intellect, humility, and patience are not relics of the past, but the architecture of resilience. As I close the book, I realize I am no longer a student, but neither was he a teacher. We were both, always, seeking peace amidst the noise. If I've learned anything from a century of noise, it's this. Wisdom doesn't age, only context does. Markets change, tools evolve, faces disappear into data, but the silent pursuit of reason remains the same flame, passed from hand to hand. So if I were to go back to being 25, not in 1934 or 2026, but now, I still wouldn't do anything exotic. I would just listen a little longer and let the silence complete the sentence.